please have your attention? Thank you. My name is Johnny Burtka. I'm the president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. It's my honor to welcome you to tonight's debate on transgenderism and law. First and foremost, I want to thank the students at the University of Pittsburgh for their warm and spirited welcome. We don't typically get this kind of feedback for ISI events, but I thank you for being here. I thank the college Republicans for their courage in helping to organize this event, the university administration for their defense of free speech and open inquiry and allowing this event to proceed. And I'd also like to thank the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation for making this event possible. Before we get to the topic at hand, I'd like to tell you briefly about my organization, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. ISI exists to provide a forum and a community for college students across the country to explore and examine fundamental questions about politics, culture, economics, and history, and to debate how to implement those ideas in American life and on their campuses, specifically to ensure that the common good and dignity of every human person is respected. We host about 150 events around the country on a wide range of topics, from lectures, debates, weekend conferences, and this debate series is part of an effort to explore questions, and we've explored a number of topics, from national security, economics, technology, to social issues. And we've actually heard from our students that it's the social issues in particular that they would like more discussion of, more debate, and more clarification. And so we've picked this issue tonight of transgenderism and law. And I understand that it's obviously a controversial topic. Over 11,000 students have signed a petition calling for this event to be canceled. But we believe that that's a signal that there's more that needs to be explored on this topic. And it touches a nerve in terms of the life in common here at the Pitt community. It touches a nerve because it's a conversation ultimately about human nature. What does it mean to be a man or a woman according to biology, to culture, to history, and to religion? And how should law and public policy reflect those realities? So tonight we gather at a university, a place of open inquiry and discourse, where we ask tough questions and examine presuppositions to confront a difficult question, and I expect our speakers to do it with patience, intelligence, honesty, and openness in an effort to pursue truth together and to deliberate, which is a hallmark of our democratic life, about how to best order our community on this important question. So without further ado, thank you all for coming tonight, and I'd like to welcome Dylan of the College Republicans to introduce our speakers.
Thank you all for coming. I'm glad you were able to make it in here through a little bit of an unanticipated crowd there. But just a quick reminder to everybody before I introduce the speakers that there's no signs, noisemakers, or disruptions permitted. And any disruptions that impede the ability of everybody in the room to view and engage in a productive conversation will have those items removed. So our first debater, Mr. Michael Knowles, is the celebrated host of The Michael Knowles Show at the Daily Wire and The Book Club at PragerU. He is also the author of the best-selling book Speechless. In 2017, Michael published the #1 national best-selling treatise, Reasons to Vote for Democrats, which President Donald Trump hailed as a great book for your reading enjoyment. In late 2020, after an appearance guest hosting the Rush Limbaugh program, it was announced that Michael's daily podcast would be syndicated to terrestrial radio. Our second debater, Brad Palumbo, is a libertarian journalist. His work has been cited by top lawmakers such as Senator Rand Paul, Senator Ted Cruz, Senator Pat Toomey, Congresswoman Nancy Mace, Congressman Thomas Massey, and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, as well as by prominent media personalities such as Sean Hannity, Ben Shapiro, and Mark Levin. Brad has also testified before the U.S. Senate, appeared on Fox News and Fox Business, and written for publications such as USA Today, National Review, Newsweek, and The Daily Beast. He co-hosts the Based Politics podcast and has a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Tonight's debate will be moderated by Leah Sargent, who is the Chief of Staff for Debates and Public Discourse at Braver Angels. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. She is the author of 2 books and has spoken on building community and constructive conflict around the world. She runs Other Feminisms, a Substack community focused on the dignity of interdependence. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
I just have to point out this is a very different welcome than we got outside. So I appreciate it.
Thank you all very much for coming. I want to give you a brief introduction to the debate format we'll be using and the goals for our debate. We're going to lead off with opening speeches of 5 minutes from each of our speakers, starting with Mr. Knowles, followed by Mr. Palumbo. They'll each have a 2-minute opportunity to rebut or respond to each other's statements, and then we'll have about 30 minutes of moderated discussion between the two panelists and me. And after that, we'll open it up to questions from the room, and I suppose, if sufficiently aerodynamic, from the outside room as well. I'm Leah Sargent. I work for Braver Angels, facilitating debates on contentious issues across the nation. And what always interests me is when there's a debate where people feel stuck, where there's a question they feel is vitally important, where they've struck out again and again in trying to address it with people they disagree with, or have felt unable to bring it up at all. I think tonight's topic certainly hits that benchmark. But what interests me about it is I think it's also two contentious topics wound up together. There's the obvious questions of gender identity and who we are, how we see each other. But then there's the second one, which is how do we live alongside each other in a pluralistic society when we disagree strongly with our neighbor, and there isn't an easy compromise. You can't average out the tax rates to decide how you'll live alongside a difference of agreement about gender identity. So I think one thing I'd like everyone to consider in attending is that whether or not you've come into the room with a very strong belief about the question of gender and transgender ideas, you may find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with the speaker you support when it comes to the question of how we navigate those differences in a pluralistic society, when the law should coerce, what we do when we disagree deeply with a friend. And I hope you'll leave this room better prepared to speak to someone who you think is living wrongly, who you love, who you can't walk away from or simply protest, and you want to figure out, how do I say I think you're wrong in a way that they'll hear as an act of love? With no further ado, Mr. Knowles.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. All right. There they are. I didn't know. I thought they might have been stuck outside. But we found them. Was that to them or to me? That was to them. Okay, it's confusing. All right. That sounds like they've gotten into harmony. Not even just melody anymore. All right. See, I was under the impression that I was opening the debate, and then Brad would follow, and then we'd have rebuttals. But I guess there was an opening act that I was not.
I thought you had to be an adult.
Yeah, no, certainly not. That hasn't been true in a while. All right. Well, as edifying as that lecture has been, I think we probably ought to get on with the debate. Thank you very much to the police for removing that. Thank you. All right. Leah, I don't want that to come off my clock. I didn't call for that.
I'm not promising anything, Michael.
I'd like to begin by thanking a few people. I want to thank Leah. I want to thank ISI. I want to thank my welcoming committee out there. I would especially like to thank Brad for pinch hitting after my original debate opponent withdrew. Brad came in at the last minute, and I really appreciate it. Professor McCloskey, who I was initially slated to debate, despite 3 degrees from Harvard, could not defend transgender ideology. He knew my views, We had chatted about them. He repeatedly expressed his desire to debate. Then at the last minute, he withdrew because, I suspect, he felt it more prudent to concede than to lose in front of C-SPAN's cameras. Even a distinguished scholar could not defend the indefensible. My opponent tonight has a more middle-of-the-road position than Professor McCloskey. Unlike Professor McCloskey, Mr. Palumbo does not believe that so-called trans women are really women. He has admitted that they're men. He doesn't think we should trans the kids. He opposes men in women's sports. But he does address men who identify as women as she and her. And he does think they should be allowed into women's bathrooms. This middle-of-the-road position makes even less sense than Professor McCloskey's. At least McCloskey is consistent. He says transgenderism is true, and therefore true for everyone of all ages. And therefore, we ought to call some men she and her, and allow them into the girls' bathroom and onto women's sports teams, and give them all the rights and privileges that our culture and law traditionally reserve for women. My opponent tonight, on the other hand, is inconsistent, even, I'm sorry to say, incoherent on this point. He says transgenderism is not true, but that we ought to pretend that it is, but only sometimes. He has said that if Blair White, who's a very nice guy, by the way, who's been on my show, if he were convicted of a crime, that he ought to be sent to a women's prison because surgery and makeup have made him sufficiently dainty, whereas burlier transgender-identifying criminals might have to stick with the men. My opponent suggests that we be dishonest enough to call men she, but honest enough not to force women to compete against men in sports, but still dishonest enough to force women to share bathrooms with men. Because the men aren't women, but they should enjoy women's rights and privileges, but only some rights and privileges, and those based on, I don't know. I'm sure Brad will do his best to explain that in just a moment. Seems a bit haphazard to me. Above all, though, my opponent believes the law should pretty much stay out of it. It is this last point that matters for tonight's debate, because tonight's debate does not concern whether transgenderism is true or even how to address it. Tonight's debate concerns a more basic question. Should the law regulate transgenderism at all? On that question, there is not much to debate, because regardless of whether or not one wishes for the law to regulate transgenderism, it will. Even the most tolerant, open-minded, pluralistic society cannot simultaneously uphold mutually contradictory principles. In even the most liberal society, the law must answer at least certain basic questions. If the law has nothing to say about what a woman is, then the law has nothing to say at all. My opponent might suggest we leave it to private business to decide, but the practical implications of transgenderism extend far beyond private business, to the military, to public schools, to government employees, and to many other sectors of society. The law cannot evade the question. The bathroom issue keeps coming up because it is so clear and so instructive. It presents a conflict between two supposed rights, the right of women to have their own bathrooms and the supposed right of some men to go into the women's bathroom, thereby abolishing women's bathrooms. The law must pick a side. There is no neutrality. Unlike some other political issues, there can be no middle ground. Either women get their own bathrooms or they don't. Either women have rights and legal protections as women, as they always have, or they don't. The law might say they do, and the law might say they don't. But the one thing the law cannot say is nothing.
Hi, everybody. I want to say thank you to ISI for having us, and thank you to Michael for being willing to have this debate. And I would like to say to the people outside or inside, who are not just interested in having their voices heard, but in trying to shut down this debate, grow the hell up. The debate is happening, whether you like it or not. It's your choice to participate in it or bury your head in the sand. This is America, we have free speech, and I just don't really stand for anybody who would try to shut down the voices they disagree with rather than engage with them. Now, I want to start by pointing out something that might seem surprising, but I am a gay agnostic libertarian, yet I recently, or not too recently, found out that I have something in common with a Orthodox Christian conservative baker you might have heard of named Jack Phillips. You see, I met him a few years ago when he was the subject of a Supreme Court case because gay rights activists had harangued him into court trying to force him to bake a gay wedding cake. Then trans activists came and invented a gender transition cake and wanted him to bake that too. But when I met him, I realized we actually had much more in common than I had ever anticipated, because we both believe in pluralism, freedom of speech, and the general laissez-faire, live and let live idea of America, that we can have radically different worldviews and beliefs, but live in peace side by side, without either side trying to conquer or force the other side to bend the knee. But those activists who chased him into court, who harassed his business, harassed his family, drove away his customers, tried to use the force of the law to eradicate his beliefs, his bigoted and evil beliefs in their view. They do not. They reject America's classically liberal, pluralistic values. And unfortunately, I have to tell you that Michael Knowles and people of his intellectual ilk, they do too. They've unfortunately become essentially a right-wing version of those LGBT activists who seek to use the state to police how other people can live their lives and restrict them from living in ways they personally disapprove of. You don't have to take my word for it. Michael recently said at a speech I'm sure you're all aware of that we should eradicate transgenderism from public life. Now, to be fair to Michael, he was not, as some of his critics have mischaracterized him, calling for pogroms or for people to be killed. But what he was calling for, and what he has called for many times in many other places, is to ban transgenderism, to ban adults from receiving medical transition treatments, to ban adults from using preferred pronouns and names in public, to ban adults from accessing facilities that align with their outward appearance. And even in the case of transgender TikToker Dylan Mulvaney, who I will admit is pretty cringe, Michael has called for Dylan Mulvaney to be institutionalized. That's what we do to serial killers who plead not guilty by virtue of mental insanity. We lock them up, deprive them of their liberty, take them away from their family. And that's what apparently folks like Michael Knowles think should be done to outspoken transgender adults, because he disapproves of their lifestyle, he disapproves of their beliefs, and he disapproves of their words. Now I'm here to suggest that that totalitarian approach to debating social issues is fundamentally inconsistent with conservative principles of individual liberty, limited government, and the classically liberal society that conservatives in the US have always wanted to conserve. But it's also remarkably short-sighted. About 30% of the United States identifies as socially conservative. About 23% identifies as Catholic, which is Michael's faith. And I'm from New England, so that I know that a lot of those Catholics are actually pretty libbed out. So what you have is a minority of the country, a small minority, that actually holds ultra-traditionalist beliefs on social issues. So if we want to start having the majority rules approach of suppressing lifestyles you don't approve of shutting down ideas, of banning ideas and lifestyles that aren't in alignment with your values, that is not going to go well for my friends on the religious right. Now, none of this is to say we must have a totally anarchist approach to transgender issues. I think we can reasonably and fairly discuss questions about medical, societal, and perhaps even governmental restrictions on things like children making decisions for medical treatments they can't really consent to, that could have life-altering consequences. I think we can protect rules that ensure fairness in sports where it's applicable. I think we can navigate these nuances without depriving our American adult peers of the right to live their lives how they see fit in accordance with their values. Because that's the test of freedom. It's easy to believe in freedom for the people you like. It's easy to believe in freedom for your friends, for the people on your team. But you have to believe in freedom for the people you don't like, the people that give you the ick. If you don't believe in freedom for anybody. And unfortunately, the approach that Michael Knowles and his ilk advocate on these issues is inconsistent with traditional conservative values of individual liberty, and it would ultimately set the stage for their own downfall. So we should take a pluralistic and classical liberal approach to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. I am shocked to hear that I'm not pluralistic. I consider myself very, very open-minded, as we all are in America, but on certain issues we cannot be totally open-minded. Because on some issues you see a conflict of rights and a conflict of claimed rights and a conflict of freedom. So if we were debating tax policy, we might come to some conciliatory middle ground and we might hear all sides. If we were discussing immigration, we might say, okay, we take in 3 million immigrants a year today. Conservatives don't want to take in any more immigrants. We've taken in a lot. But okay, let's meet in the middle somewhere. On this issue, we can't do that because either the women have the bathrooms or they don't. Either the women have the sports teams or they don't. Certain issues, you can't just meet in the middle. On certain issues, you would split the baby, which is no good for anybody. So here, Brad is claiming the freedom of the transgender identifying people, men who think that they're women mistakenly, to enter into the women's bathroom. And what I'm defending is the genuine freedom and right of women to have their own bathrooms. Only one of those is going to win out. Only one of those is in accordance with reality. So I would just as soon defend the one that happens to align with the truth. Now, a lot of what Brad just said is not true. Brad said that America is very liberal and open-minded on these transgender issues. It doesn't seem to be the case. According to Pew Research, 60% of Americans say that manhood and womanhood is determined by biological sex. So I wish it were 100%, but 60% is not bad. It's a clear majority of the country. It's up from 56% just a couple of years ago, and it's up from 54% in 2017. So the American people are on our side on transgender issues because they have eyes and a brain, and the American people are increasingly on our side on these issues. As for the freedom of these people to mutilate themselves and to harm themselves, I wonder if Brad would extend that same conception of freedom to someone who suffers from a body integrity disorder. Body integrity disorder is very similar to transgenderism in that it involves people, usually early onset, about 8 to 12 years old, who will imagine that a healthy limb does not really belong to them, and they'll ask a doctor to cut off that healthy limb. This would be medical malpractice today. I don't think any of us would want to allow some poor soul to have their limbs chopped off because of a disorder. We would want to give them psychiatric treatment. So I don't really see why the same principle wouldn't hold true here, especially considering the very harmful effects of the transition. The largest data set on sex reassignment procedures, both hormonal and surgical, reveals no mental health benefits whatsoever. This was in October 2019, the American Journal of Psychiatry. In fact, what the data set showed was that the transition made the patient's mental health deteriorate, at least on one point, which is anxiety. Rates of transgender regret are skyrocketing. Lord Robert Winston, surgeon and scientist in the UK, found that 40% of people who undergo what we'll call euphemistically bottom surgery experience complications. Many need further surgery. A quarter of the women who undergo top surgery feel uncomfortable with what they have done. This harms people immensely. It is growing. It is raging. The numbers of young people who identify with it have doubled in recent years, and that's why we shouldn't subject people to it. Thank you, Leah, for that very kind reminder that I've gone over time.
Thank you.
So a few points to touch on there, but as to the question of polling, the American public's view on these issues is pretty nuanced, but I could also show you polls that say 60, 70% of Americans believe in anti-discrimination protections for transgender people. In fact, I think the eradicate transgenderism from public life position, even as Michael describes it, not as his critics do, is not going to poll high in America. And if all you have to offer to one extreme is the opposite extreme, you're actually making that opposite extreme more likely to succeed. Imagine if instead of running against gun control, you had to run on let people own nukes. Imagine if instead of running on let's not do socialism, you had to run on abolish Social Security, abolish Medicare, abolish everything. Obviously, you're going to be less successful at actually achieving power, at winning an election, at building a consensus to accomplish what you want to accomplish, which in our case, for example, is protecting children, protecting fairness in sports, these kinds of things, if all you're offering is the complete and opposite extreme. And that's what Knowles and his company are offering. As far as bodily integrity disorder or the benefits to transition supposedly not existing, I'm not here to quibble with the scientific data. I'm not an expert in any of that, and neither is Michael. I'm here to say it's not up to us. You're a fully grown adult. It's up to you to decide what's best for you. And as far as chopping off your limbs and bodily disorder, no doctor in their right mind is going to do that. And whether you agree with it or not, it is the case that most doctors, most medical authorities, most medical bodies do recommend transition for adults with persistent gender dysphoria. So I don't view it as my place or our place to get in the way of that relationship. If that's what they want to do, if that's what will make them happy, who are we to second guess it? Who are we to tell them how to live their lives? I don't want the government policing my wardrobe, my speech, what pronouns I use. I don't want the government telling me what I can believe, what I can say, how I can live my life. If you don't want that, you have to respect that for transgender adults as well.
All right, I'll start with a question for each speaker, and we'll have a medium free-flowing conversation moderated by my gavel. Sure. Mr. Palumbo, in your rebuttal, you were saying that your concern is about the efficacy of Mr. Knowles' approach. It's not popular. I'm curious both whether you think he's right and he should just be differently strategic in how he approaches it, and whether it's always ineffective to make an unpopular point plainly and honestly, or kind of as a feint. Should the anti-abortion, pro-life movement have responded to kind of the backlash after Dobbs by kind of hiding their commitment to a pro-life cause or by openly making the arguments?
Yeah, so I think it's both. I don't fully agree with Michael's positions, but also from a pure tactical position, I would say it's wrong to run on the opposite extreme. A good example of this is, you want to use the abortion context. I live in Michigan. We had a governor candidate there, Tudor Dixon, who ran on no abortion exceptions, no rape, no incest, life of the mother maybe. She lost terribly. It was every single ad because that was a wildly unpopular position. And as a result, those are like 2% of abortions or whatever. You could have had a governor that would have worked to restrict 98% of abortions. And instead you have Gretchen Whitmer. So you're not going to convince me that just taking the most extreme position because it's honest or because you believe it fully, it's naive if your goal is to actually achieve change. I'm also, of course, just coming at it from a fundamentally different premise in which, look, I believe there's two biological sexes. They are immutable. But there's a lot that we attach to gender that is social. And if someone like Blair White, who I consider an acquaintance and am friendly with, if she wants to live as a woman, have surgery as she has, if that's what will make her happy, and she struggled with deep depression and mental issues, and then that helped, why would I object to that? And moreover, why would I embrace some sort of one-size-fits-all government approach that would legally force somebody with C-cup tits to use the men's room and the boys' locker room? It doesn't make any sense.
I think the more concern you have for women, the less you should use the word tits on the stage. I mean it. Mr. Knowles, I know that you think that when someone asks you to address them by their pronouns, their preferred pronouns, they're asking you to lie to them or be complicit in a lie. But that's clearly not the only time that you believe you're asked to lie in a pluralistic society. And I don't usually see you going to Episcopalian churches to tell them you don't believe they're offering the body of Christ.
But I'm not asked to go to Episcopalian churches, mercifully.
Well, I was going to ask, why? But that's a higher stakes question for you, right? Where is Christ present? Where is he not? Why is this the issue where you want to bring the force of law, the force of your voice, to contest this disagreement among the many you have with your neighbors?
Well, because this one would appear to be exclusive. This one is inescapable. I can escape from the Episcopalian church down the street, and I don't attend it. I can escape from many liberal Catholic churches down the street, by the way, for that matter, and there's no problem. Nobody's forcing me to attend. But on the question here, women will have bathrooms or they won't. Women will have sports teams or they won't. And I will engage in conversation with people because we live in a society. We're not atomized individuals, and no man is an island entire of himself. So when I am to refer to somebody, especially as a matter of public life, if I am not permitted to refer to him as him and her as her, I am being forced to lie in my regular everyday life. Contrary to what Brad suggested, I am not a totalitarian, I'm not an authoritarian, I'm not against pluralism or whatever, but there are certain issues on which one side has to win and one side has to lose because they can't exist together at the same time. So Brad points out that Blair, who's a very nice guy, as I pointed out, might feel better by being allowed to go into a women's bathroom. I'm skeptical of that. None of the data, which I always think are ridiculous, but I'm happy to cite social science when it backs up my point. But all of the data that we have suggests that there is no mental health benefit whatsoever from these sorts of surgeries and from the hormone therapies. So I'm skeptical that it would make him feel any better. But then I have to ask, what about the women? What about the women who would very much like to have their own bathrooms? Wouldn't that make them happy? Don't they have some rights?
So I want to press you here because you're falling on the bathroom example when you've also talked about involuntary commitment. And I think on the spectrum of where the law intervenes, the bathroom is both kind of the least, charged issue to kind of fall back on, and saying at a certain point of delusion, I think someone who disagrees with me on this issue should be confined. I want to hear you defend that point rather than the bathroom access.
Well, I think that what's very important here is prudence. This is one of those forgotten virtues that people in our highly ideological age think that we need to have a manifesto written in 5 bullet points on a napkin to answer every question. But for example, if someone is a man who has fallen into the transgender rabbit hole, and for him it is, as it historically has been for pretty much everybody, a sexual fetish, a paraphilia of cross-dressing that is largely driven by pornography today. But that man still understands that he's a man. This is just a little weird thing that he does at home, and it makes him have a thrill, and okay, fine, we live in a fallen world. I wouldn't suggest we need to commit that man. But there is a spectrum here of irrationality and insanity. Let's call it what it is. And so if a man is convinced that he really is a woman, like in some of those viral videos we've all seen of the big burly man screaming in the bodega, my name is ma'am, and he's acting out in a way that is really disorderly and disrupting the public and harmful to himself. For instance, if he wants to chop off his own healthy body parts and cause all sorts of destruction to himself, then I think not only is it the right of society to take some action here to restore order, but I think it's only compassionate for that person. I think it's a very selfish and shallow kind of liberalism that says that when people have mental problems, we ought to just let them out on the street, often to die of exposure or to go do drugs in some back alley in San Francisco. No, we owe them help. Brad asks, who am I to tell people what to do? Why would I use the force of government? We live in America. America is at least supposed to be a self-government. You're a citizen with faculties of reason and a moral conscience. You can perceive truth, and it is not only your right, but your responsibility to do so, to help your fellow countrymen.
I'll give you a moment. Yes, absolutely.
Can you explain, Michael, why you want the government to be the arbiter of truth, to decide what beliefs? I mean, I've lived through the government tell us there were WMDs in Iraq, lie to us every which way about COVID, and you are saying that the government and the people that run it should be an arbiter of truth and then should involuntarily commit and basically lock people up who don't meet their perception of the truth. Can you explain to me, as a matter of prudence, how that could possibly be a good idea?
Well, I'm not saying that the government is the arbiter of truth, of course not, but we have civil authority to establish and to enforce laws. And so we can either establish and enforce laws on the basis of pure will, a man who says, I very much want to be a woman, and so that's what we're going to do, completely divorced from reality and the moral order, or we can establish and enforce laws as a matter of interpretation, to believe that there is such a thing as objective reality and a moral order and a natural law that we are then translating into the civil law. Traditionally, in our country and in all states, we have pursued the latter. In our age that now seems to be increasingly untethered from reality, where people will mock the very notion of objective truth, we say that cannot happen. But to my points earlier, The law will say something, inevitably. The government is not some foreign entity. We live in America, where we have some say in our government, even still today, and the law must necessarily say something. Either the women get... the reason I keep going to the bathrooms is because it's just so clear, but you can use the sports teams, you can use...
I think the involuntary commitment one is relevant, though, because I think, this is not the level of force that Mr. Palumbo is worried about as worried about bathroom
I suppose...
rules.
Right. I mean, bathrooms are smaller scale, but what I would say is that these issues are complicated, and they should be decentralized. Let a business decide their own bathroom policies. I've been to a lot of places in liberal cities that solve this by having single-stall unisex bathrooms. Fantastic. Don't have a one-size-fits-all solution crammed on the whole country.
I'm going to stay on the commitment question for a second so Mr. Palumbo can field a question himself. Certainly the government does draw lines around some people who should be committed, whether due to risk to others or sometimes risk to themselves. I'm curious how you, Mr. Palumbo, feel the government should respond. Is it right to commit someone for treatment for anorexia, which does not put them as a danger to others, purely because we believe them to be a danger to themselves, to have a false belief about their body?
I think there has to be a very high threshold for civil commitment. We've seen it horribly abused in the past in this country. But I think it has to be a direct danger to themselves or others, right? Their physical safety. So trans or not trans, if somebody is a danger, a suicide risk, or if they're a threat to others, then we can discuss involuntary commitment. But what we're talking about here is essentially saying, well, we think somebody has deluded and wrong beliefs, so they should be locked up. I mean, that would have gotten that's the approach that had people wanting to lock up and kill Galileo for daring to suggest that the Earth was not the center of the universe. I don't think we all know the truth. That's part of the process of discovering the truth. And let me just say, and I'm not saying this, but a large swath of the country thinks that the Catholic faith, believing in a God, is a deluded belief, is a delusion. Should they want to have you committed?
No, the majority of Americans still believe in God.
I don't think...
Maybe not in 50 years,
right,
but
so
today they still do.
In the interest of the best use of this time, I'm waiting up. The Galileo fisticuffs happen outside. And
I will point out on that point that they did lock up Galileo, and they locked him up for being a jerk. It had nothing to do with his stupid scientific book.
I would gloss it if they locked Galileo up for being politically taking chances that were imprudent. But what I want to ask here on this question for a moment is, when it comes to these questions, you've said it's hard to be sure, right? You've said, Mr. Palumbo, that you're not an expert in the science. Mr. Knowles, you've brought a number of citations with varying confidence in different ones. What is your greatest source of uncertainty for each of you right now about the current growth in transgender identification, in the roots of it, and what would you most like to know that you don't know now?
Well, I would just like to correct you, Leah. You've said that I've had varying degrees of confidence in the scientific studies. I have no confidence in any of them. I'm just citing them because they back up my argument.
What would you actually like to see studied? I mean it, right?
Kudos for honesty.
I think you're right that this is an issue that's been understudied because no one does a randomized controlled trial. That's true of a lot of things where we really care about the answer. So what would you most like to see studied in a scientific context that you think would help you and your opponents at the end of it have a better understanding of what's true?
I would most like to see this issue studied not through biology and not through some bizarre sociology course in a gender studies department, but through anthropology and through ontology and through philosophy. Because ultimately what this comes down to, I'm happy that all the scientific studies back up my view, but I wouldn't really care even if they didn't. Because the question is, what is the human person? The claim of transgenderism, it keeps moving, but the claim basically is that one's true self has nothing to do with one's body. So one can be in body entirely a man, but at some deeper metaphysical level, one can be a woman. And so the old way we used to talk about this would be the distinction between the body and the soul. And there's been a whole lot written about the relationship between the body and the soul. The conception that has dominated for at least 2,300 years in our civilization is an idea called hylomorphism, which is that body and soul are united, and sex derives from the body and is an inseparable accident of the individual that persists and applies to the whole person. So that's, to me, a fascinating conversation. Maybe eyes are glazing over here in the room. But the question that we're asking here is, what is a man? What is a woman? And I am am not happy with even the conservative answer, which is a woman is a womb and 2 X chromosomes. I don't know what 2 X chromosomes are. If you told me that a woman is sugar, spice, and everything nice, that to me is a much more precise description and accurate description of what a woman is. So I'm happy to have those conversations.
But I don't think that is the question. I think the question is who gets to decide. If
Well,
you would have the government decide for everyone, and I would have people decide for themselves in their own laws.
Let me ask you then, Mr. Palumbo. One question the government does make a decision on that arguably is a murkier question is, when is someone legally, morally, intellectually an adult?
Right.
And that's something where the government cannot remain silent. We write a lot of laws to draw a relatively sharp line between children and adults, even though nothing magical happens on your 18th or 21st, or for the purposes of running for Congress, I think 25th birthday. But the law has to speak. So how do you think about when the law has to draw a distinction? How do you want it to draw it?
I think that 18 is an imperfect legal age of adulthood, but it's the one we have, and we should stick to it. You're either an adult or you're not. And once you're an adult, you have the full freedoms and rights and responsibilities that come with our society, and that should include living your life in a way that traditionalist conservatives don't approve of, think is wrong, think is gross, think is bad. But for minors, I think it is fair to talk about not nearly enough safeguards on this care. I question whether they can even consent to it at all.
But I think I have a better sense right now from Mr. Knowles about how he would work through the anthropological question of when should the law set that limit. You say you're comfortable with the current one. Are you comfortable with 19? If the country were with you?
I mean, it's inherently arbitrary. I would say it just has to be consistent. Right now we kind of have a patchwork of things, like 21 for some things, 18 for some things, 17 for some things. I agree it will be fundamentally arbitrary. I just think it should be consistent. So it could be 18, it could be 19, it could be 21. What irks me is when it's inconsistent.
Well, what I'm asking you just for a moment is there's the question of is it inconsistent and the question of is it correct? And I'm curious, what do you draw on to answer the question of is it correct? You're trying to draw them to some common number, but maybe you want that one to be right.
Yeah.
Where do you get your account of the human person to decide what it means to pass into maturity?
I think what we're talking about when we talk about a legal age of adulthood is your ability to fully understand what's going around you, your brain development, your ability to inform consent to something, right? And I don't have a great way of drawing the line that's not kind of arbitrary, but you do have to draw it somewhere.
I will allow Mr. Knowles the obvious.
Yeah, well, I don't think that one's view has to be arbitrary on this matter. I don't think my view is arbitrary. I just don't think transgenderism is true.
Well, we're talking about age. We're talking about age.
But this gets to age because for all of human history, pretty much no one has thought that the transgender idea really is true. And you don't seem to think that it really is true. It's interesting.
Well, I think I view it different. I have a different definition of it.
But here's the inconsistency that I find in your point. You say that when you turn 18, you ought to be able to chop yourself up and put on a dress and go into a women's bathroom. And putting aside the public issues that come from that, I just wonder how it is the case that transgenderism is false for the first 18 years and then suddenly becomes true when one turns 18. And if that is not what's really happening, if it is false and your trepidation in exposing children to this is because it obviously is false, if it's false and harmful for children, why is it beneficial and true for adults? Shouldn't we apply an even standard across the board and come to a conclusion?
So you often set this up as a dichotomy, but I think that it either has to be true for all or false for all. I think it's a false dichotomy. I think the issue is children cannot fully consent to the full consequences of a life-altering medical procedure. We're not even talking about social transition. I think if you have a persistent gender dysphoric 13-year-old, and you want to have them socially transition, I think that's up to parents. Conservatives were just screaming yesterday about parental rights. I'm fine with that.
But not parental wrongs.
You should have the right, with only very, very high exceptions in extreme cases, to parent your kids rightly or wrongly. And it's not badly or well, except for extreme cases of abuse.
So I'd actually like you to draw that out for a second here, because I think the thing that we can all agree on in this room is that parents make life-altering decisions for and with their kids outside the question of gender. Mr. Knowles' choice to raise his children Catholic sets a mark on them that they may diverge, but they'll still have been raised Catholic in their beginnings.
But you can convert, you can't undo a lot of the medical transition things. It can permanently sterilize you for life.
So that's what I'm asking about a little. How are you thinking about what a parent can and cannot consent to on behalf of their child?
I think the same way a parent cannot consent to sex on behalf of their child. There's obviously a level of physical maturity you have to reach before you can make potentially life-altering decisions about your body. And so something like raising your kids Catholic, well, if your kid grows up and wants to become Jewish or an atheist, they can't undo a bottom surgery, right? Not really. So that's why I draw that distinction. And I would just say, to Michael's point that it either has to be true for everyone or false for everyone, first off, we're talking about the government as an arbiter of truth or not, but also we can have different standards for kids and adults. You can't get a tattoo as a child. You can't drink. You can't buy a gun. You can't go into our movie. You can have different standards. It's a false dichotomy.
You can take hormones if your parents wear you're too short as a child, and I'm curious whether you think that's something parents should consent to. Doctors will give you growth hormones if you're projected to be short enough that they worry it will impact your quality of life.
Yeah, I think there's a very different between...
And it's permanent, it's not undoable.
Between that
the child
and, for
can kind of
example,
only
like
guess so much what it's like to be an adult.
precocious puberty, right? When sometimes you'll have a rare case where a 7-year-old will start going through
So
puberty.
I want to unpack the difference between these two. Precocious puberty is slowing down something that will happen.
Right.
Choosing to give your child growth hormones is triggering a permanent change that cannot be undone. Do you think parents should be able to consult to growth hormones on behalf of their child when they're told their child will be very short? It's a choice parents make across the country.
I would say if there's not going to be like life-altering harm and consequences for it, yes. But I mean, the difference is like if you go through gender transition as a minor and never go through your natal sex as puberty, you often lose fertility for life. That's not quite the same thing as being a few inches taller or not.
Interestingly, the pitch is often, in some sense, about preserving future fertility insofar as the doctor worries being too short will inhibit your ability to find a spouse.
Well, that's a whole other issue.
All right. Mr. Knowles, I want to ask you the question that you aren't going to get asked by Mr. Palumbo because you're debating him rather than Ms. McCloskey. People report, and you disagree, that they have a different anthropology than you. They don't agree with your description of the soul. And what they say is, I see my child, I see them light up when they get to dress in the way they want. I see them feel more comfortable. Even aside from those longer term questions, how can I as a parent be so sure when you tell me that when I see my child feel more comfortable, they're wrong and I'm wrong, when in anything else, if they signed up for Little League and it really fit for them, I would go with it, I would explore it. And your answer here is not. So how do you answer that sense of a parent's sense of their own child and that particular child's response to a transgender feeling?
I think this point by the phantom of Professor McCloskey is a very good one, because it would seem to me that what transgenderism is proposing is an anthropology. It's an idea about what human nature is. And so if it is true, then it is true for children, and I'm not using this to suggest we get rid of transing the kids. Ultimately, I think that, of course. But if it's true, then it would seem to me very cruel to prevent a child from transitioning, especially before puberty. Because if you can suppress a child's puberty, and then you can put them on cross-sex hormones, and then you can have the little boy look more like a little girl, he is going to much more successfully pass as the opposite sex than if he were to be put on these kinds of hormones and have these procedures much later. It would be much more expensive, it would be much more painful. And so if transgenderism is true, then I think we have to trans the kids. Now, it so happens that transgenderism is not true, and there are people who are in all various states of anxiety and depression and suicidality even, who have fallen into this confusion of transgenderism later on. And so just as I think it would be wrong to lead children who are behaving in an irrational way down this path, I think it would be quite wrong to do that to adults as well. Mr. Palumbo has conceded the point that at the extremes of anorexia, it would be fine to force feed somebody or force somebody into hospitalization. Mr. Palumbo has made the point that someone suffering body identity disorder would not be able to get this sort of a surgery to remove a limb. What doctor in his right mind would do it? I will point out there are doctors today removing the healthy breasts of 14-year-old girls, so I think you can find a lot of quacks out there. In fact, there have been quacks who have performed this surgery, but none of us, I think, believes that we ought to chop off the healthy limbs of these very mentally ill people. So I just don't see why we wouldn't apply that down the line. Professor McCloskey's position is a consistent position, and it's consistently wrong. And I think that if we're going to be right here, we have to be consistently right. To Brad's point that he keeps saying, why would you want the government to do this? Why would you trust the government? I've said it before, I suppose I'll say it again. In the United States, we are the government. Even with all the corruption, we are the government. And if we surrender our capacity for reason and moral conscience, if we really say that we can't know the difference between true and false and right and wrong, then we're surrendering self-government. This is what John Adams meant when he said the Constitution's built for a moral and religious people. That wasn't soft soap and a nice platitude. He's saying that's how self-government works. If we surrender that, we lose the American project.
Mr. Palumbo, I do want to ask you the same question. What would you say to a parent who says, I want to take care of my child, everything I see in my child's behavior, not just in what they tell me, but in the way they act when I address them in one way or the other, when I put them with one group of kids or the other, tells me they're happier this way and uncomfortable the other, but you say I can't do this till they're 18. Why?
Well, to clarify, I'm okay with them socially transitioning.
But I think you know that that's not always where people want to stop.
I agree.
Right? So what would you say to that parent?
The reason that is not appropriate is that child is too young to really consent to the life-altering possibilities of that, but two, going through puberty of your natal sex. We okay?
Some people were transitioning to the front rows, and so I think the security got a little worried about that.
Okay. I'll just start over.
So again, I'd like to ask the question again, because I think the reason the noises are so loud out there and the reason everyone got quiet when we saw someone moving is that people think the stakes of this question are high.
They are.
And that parents worry if they listen to you, Mr. Palumbo, and wait and act later, they may not be taking care of their child or loving their child as they are. And it sounds like you're all right with them doing that later, but not earlier. And I think that's a big burden of proof for that question.
I understand completely, and that's why I think this is a really complicated issue. I don't envy a parent who has a child with severe gender dysphoria. I can see why they would be incredibly torn on what the right thing to do is. But what I will say is that it's actually the process of going through puberty as your natal sex that often causes gender incongruity to desist. So the problem is that now they go on puberty blockers, then they do cross-sex hormones. They never actually go. That's why previously, decades ago, when you had gender incongruent youth, many of them grew up to be gay men or lesbian women. And that was because when they went through their puberty, they reconciled their gender. They realized the things they were feeling didn't mean they were actually trapped in the wrong body.
Is there a point after a certain trial of puberty where you'd feel comfortable with a minor transitioning when they say, I've given it a good shot, Mr. Palumbo, like you said this works for some people, it doesn't work for me?
That's why it's so hard to have the government come in and set a one-size-fits-all rule. I have also said that, I think the age of consent should be 18, but in some states it's 16 or 17. It would make sense to me then that in those states you could also transition gender at 16 or 17. But I don't know exactly where to draw the line. And that's part of my point here, is that Michael keeps saying transgenderism is false. And if it is false, it should be banned. I don't believe the government should be in the business of banning false ideas. Michael's also said that transgenderism is a false religion. So then we want to ban religions. I'm wondering what happened to freedom of religion? What happened to freedom of speech? And also, the average federal bureaucrat has the politics of Elizabeth Warren. And I know you can cite noble things about self-government, but the truth is we have a bloated bureaucracy that does not represent the American people. It is an entrenched political class with politics much different than yours. So the idea that we're going to make that government the arbiter of what ideas are true and false and ban or eradicate some ideas as a result of that seems to me not just a bad idea on principle, but incredibly short-sighted for people from your background and worldview and values.
Mr. Knowles, how do you think you would fare under a government that has the reach and intimacy that you are advocating for?
I think I would fare fairly well because, while I agree with Brad's point that we have far too many bureaucrats on the federal payroll, the recent upending of laws concerning sex and gender have come from elected and appointed officials. It's come from the Supreme Court, appointed by presidents. It's come from legislators in Charlotte, North Carolina, and all over the country. So it has been from representatives of the people and appointed officials who've been appointed by representatives of the people, and the people change their minds. That's one of the features of democracy. And so, unfortunately, the Supreme Court in 1973 decided that there were some imaginary right to abortion, and this error persisted for a long time. And then 49 years later, the court reversed that decision. In 2020, the Supreme Court made an error and decided to interpret civil rights law protections for sex as being protections for sexual orientation and gender identity, which ironically undermines civil rights protections for sex by allowing the men to play on those sports teams and go to the bathrooms. And so in this case, I know, Brad, you keep suggesting that I want this very narrow, authoritarian, totalitarian view. I don't. There are all sorts of questions where I'm happy to leave things pretty open. But on certain issues where only one side can establish its principle in society, we have to come to conclusions. And I would come to the conclusion that has prevailed for all of human history, not the one that cropped up 5 seconds ago.
So I want to push a little on what pressing on these questions and these distinctions means for kind of the stability of our democracy.
Yep.
Because it's one thing when losing power means, losing a little bit of ground on some parts of your agenda, the tax rates are set differently, more or fewer oil wells are drilled. And another thing when laws kind of seesaw wildly between administrations.
Yep.
We have the gag rule on abortion. It's one example of a law that just gets flipped on and off every time the administration changes, and it feels like more and more laws are in that all or nothing executive order thing. It seems to me that makes every election feel apocalyptic.
Yes.
We get more of the Flight 93 talk, right? How do you see a way out or through that, right? If people feel losing an election means losing ground possibly permanently, it doesn't seem we can live alongside each other at all. We've already lost faith in democracy, kind of regardless of where we draw the line when we're in power.
This is such an important point. And the reason that you've seen this kind of radical polarization where now we go topsy-turvy every election is every election that we're able to win, for that matter. Sometimes the Democrats rule for a long time. The reason for that is because we no longer have shared norms and standards. And so the very thing that I am arguing is a solution to this problem. The reason that our norms and standards have broken down is because half a century ago, leftist activists decided to upend our standards and norms in our culture, to say that having any standards or norms at all would be authoritarian and anti-American. And so what happened was the left pushed their radical new standards. In the 1950s, in the 1940s, you could read the Bible in schools. You could not read pornography in schools. Today, you cannot read the Bible in schools. You can, and in some cases, are assigned to read pornography in schools. It's not a battle of more freedom or less freedom. It's a battle of what standards are we going to have, what taboos are we going to have. And so what happened, especially in the 60s, is the left knocked down all of the old standards. They insisted upon their standards in their place, and the conservatives lost the ability to even speak about standards, to even speak about the good, the true, and the beautiful, the common good, what's true and false. And as a result, the left has totally upended things. But I think if we can reassert a sensible vision, then things will go less topsy-turvy.
I'm going to indulge my nerdery for 1 second, then pose a last question to you two, then we'll take questions from the audience. Mr. Knowles, do you really think this is a question of the left pushing, or more of what Alistair McIntyre describes as just the losing, for many people, including conservatives, of a sense of where order comes from, till we don't have a language to speak together? Not one side putting forward new norms, but all sides nearly losing touch with what gives rise to their norms that they learned kind of habitually from their community without learning them from the roots up.
Well,
because I think you're blaming just one side here, and I don't know that I believe you on that.
No, I blame both of those things, but I think one is a consequence of the other. If not entirely a consequence, largely a consequence. Why are people not in touch with the basis of order and truth? Might it have something to do with the fact that left-wing activists booted the Bible out of schools? Why is it that people don't have a solid formation about the grounding of our government and our public life? Might it have something to do with the fact that a judge decided that preachers can no longer speak about political things, that religion now has to be merely a private matter for the inner closet of your own consciousness rather than a matter of public life? To me, these are not separate questions. And I point to the left because they have been so conscious and intentional about this kind of a strategy, and because the feckless conservatives bought on with the logic. There's a line from William F. Buckley Jr., who's very important to this organization, that I always come back to from God and Man at Yale. And he was quoting a liberal, actually, who said it. And he said, "Skepticism has utility only when it leads to conviction. It's nice to have a big open society, but sometimes people's minds are so open that their brains fall out. A poem is beautiful because of its limits and its constraints. We are limited beings, and so we can't be all things to all people, because then we're not anything to anyone."
Can I just hop
Yes,
in
you
and
may.
say
I
something?
gave him a bit of time there, yes.
Yeah. So you say that you want the truth, the freedom to speak the truth and the good and the beautiful and everything else. But at the same time, I mean, you'd toss up and rip up the First Amendment to stop drag queens from reading books to kids.
The First Amendment doesn't protect that.
It does.
It doesn't. The First Amendment, from the beginning of our country, has not protected whole scores of speech. Obscenity, notably, in this case.
It is not obscene if it's... So first of all, you could ban all sexual performances, drag or not, from having minors, and I would support that. But to have a fully clothed...
So you'll shred the First Amendment?
No, that is obscenity. There's a very clear standard of what obscenity is. And a fully clothed person, who is simply dressed in the attire of the other gender and wearing makeup, reading books to children, is protected by the First Amendment.
Brad, for much of our country's history, cross-dressing was illegal throughout the country, including in San Francisco.
Acts. We had slavery, just because we didn't always live up to the
We still
values.
have part of the Alien Sedition Acts.
But they're not enforced. But so I'm saying just because we had things in the past doesn't mean they're actually consistent with our rights and values.
I suppose what you're saying, though, Brad, is, Michael, your view is anti-American, and it's not consistent with the First Amendment. And what I'm pointing to is the people who wrote the First Amendment, the people who ratified the First Amendment, the people who lived in a country under the First Amendment for the vast majority of our country's history, they all agreed with me, and people in very recent times have started to pervert the meaning of the First Amendment to kind of agree with your
The people who wrote the First Amendment also wrote the Alien and Seditions Act.
So now you're saying the First Amendment's no good.
Sure. But the text of the Constitution and the principles outlined are what's important, not the imperfections of the people that drafted them.
This is what I want to ask you a little bit about where you see those principles and what they lead to. Because I think there are two ways to interpret what we want out of free speech, and I know which side Mr. Dole stands on, so he's not getting the questions. Yes. One is that free speech, open discourse, is a good in and of itself, possibly to avoid coercion or too large a government that would be needed to suppress speech. But the other view, which is the view I know Mr. Knowles holds, so he's not going to need to respond to this one, is that the reason we want freedom of speech is to arrive at truth, in the same way that we want peer review in scientific journals, not so that there's ultimately a panoply of voices, but so that by hearing everyone out, we wind up with one voice speaking one thing that is true. And I'm curious, for you, Mr. Palumbo, do you see the point of free speech as an end in itself, a protection from coercion, or as a tool to slowly, gravitate towards one thing that is true, and free speech is a tool that gets us there, but not the good we are pursuing?
So I definitely reject the utilitarian view of free speech. Now, I think to some extent both can coexist, in that I think the best ideas do win out over time, and that sunlight can be a strong form of disinfectant. But there is utility in and of itself of letting man be free to say wrong and false things.
And tell me about what you like about that, because you've rejected one version of it. So what is the good you see in doing that?
That's the most fundamental aspect of if you're not free to speak, you're not free to think, right? That is one of the most fundamental things about humanity.
I'm going to press one more time, just because for the interest of time, I'm going to do it more briefly than I know Mr. Knowles would. What is the good of being free to think?
To explore and find the best ideas, in part, but also to fulfill the human experience. That's what life is learning and making your way through the world and deciding what you believe. And if you're not free to think and you're not free to speak, you're not able to do that. So it's like the idea of, for example, coerced morality isn't really morality, right? Because if people are doing the right thing or believing that, for example, like everyone's very loyal to Kim Jong-un in North Korea. But there's not actually much value in that loyalty because it's done at the threat of death.
A lot of value for Kim Jong-un.
All right, at this point...
And you would like to be Kim Jong-un.
Do you? I don't think I would. I
wouldn't
look as good in the suits. I don't think I would.
I have more questions, but since I am not Kim Jong-un, I will not be a tyrant and use the time for questions. I want to look a little at the ISI host. We have a mic over in the corner. Is the plan for people to approach the mic? Just to check, since it's just tucked in the corner. I want to remind people that the best way of asking your question is to have it formed very clearly in your mind before you step up, to give other people the best chance of also asking theirs. Questions should be 3 to 5 sentences, brief to the point, because I want as many voices to be heard here as possible. So, questions from the body.
Hey, thanks for coming, guys. I've been a fan of both you for a long time, mostly Brad, though.
Hey, there's one. We got
one. The reason I'm a libertarian is because government is inherently a monopoly on violence that will always further accumulate more wealth and power no matter what you do. So having said that, my question is for Michael. As the size of government has grown, so has the acceptance of alternative or degenerate lifestyles on a systemic scale. Culture and the legal system reflect this. How can you recognize this fact while believing that simply using the state to fight this behavior in the legal system will lead to the necessary cultural change to eradicate it from public life?
Well, the government hasn't just grown. I guess that's the misconception at the heart of this. Yes, obviously, we're a much bigger country now, 330 million people. The federal government is much more powerful than it was some 200 years ago. But in other ways, the government has weakened. In other ways, the ability of local governments to control their own communities and set standards, that's weakened considerably. The ability of school boards to set curricula now is quite controversial. The rights of states have completely gone away. The states essentially have no real power anymore if they ever disagree with the federal government. So once again, I don't think this is an issue just of government getting really big or government getting really small. Conservatives have never supported small government. It's not possible for a country of 330 million people with a global empire to have a small government. What we can have is a limited government. So we want government to be within its natural and proper limits. And so when we're talking about the limits of the government, especially in a self-government such as ours, we have this question: do we have the political right to set certain standards? Are our rights merely the individual licenses to pursue whatever delusional and depraved sexual identities that we want to pursue, or any other kind of fantastical ideas? Or do we have an exalted freedom that will suppress some of our lower appetites, but will give us a flourishing community? That latter idea was the idea that has animated our country, that made our country great, that made our whole civilization great. As we've lost that, the government's gotten all out of whack, as you described, and the country's gone to pot.
That was an admirably concise question. I'd ask you both to kind of imitate questioners in concise.
That was a less admirably concise answer.
A little
Yeah.
bit.
No.
Just to get as many as possible. We'll go to the next one. I'll throw a dichotomy as we go. America is too large to be justly governed, yes or no?
America is not too large to be justly governed. There have been plenty of empires that have been justly governed.
Dichotomy.
Well, I'd suggest we should maybe be doing a little bit less of the worldwide empire part.
Fair enough.
Sure.
But also,
sure.
I would say it is too large to be governed by one large federal government, and that's why it should be decentralized as much as possible.
Next question from the students.
Thank you guys both for coming. As an aspiring journalist, political content creator, you guys have been keeping me busy over the last couple of weeks. I appreciate that. I'm a senior at Point Park University. It's probably about 15 minutes from here. The school made headlines last year for their implemented pronoun mandate, saying that if students told you what their pronouns are and you didn't abide by that you can get in trouble through administration. It being a private university, how do you recommend not only fighting back against that rule, but having students who are mainly liberal on that campus kind of see your side of that argument?
The university is obviously very liberal, and so they probably buy into all sorts of student governance kind of silly policies. So you could try to get some power and wield it that way. But as you point out, it's a school. It has the right to set its own standards, especially as a private university. It can do that. And so ultimately, if you can't persuade the administration to do it, you might have to seek out a community that's more reasonable and that very likely will provide you with a better education if the school that you're attending doesn't know the difference between men and women.
Yeah, I think I agree with Michael. They're a private school. They can have stupid anti-free speech policies if they want, but I think you should transfer.
We all want to.
Oh yeah, for sure. My bad. Mr. Palumbo, it's awesome that you could come here on such short notice. How much did they pay you to do it?
A lot.
Sorry.
I can't get a dollar amount.
One question per participant.
Yeah, sorry, that's your question.
Leah, could I have a follow-up, though? Could I have a follow-up? Are you getting paid more than me? Because we have to talk about this afterward. This is...
I'll go for
Hi, I'd like to say thank you so much to Michael, for coming out. It's been a real pleasure hearing you speak. My question actually goes to both of you, though. So I know with you, Brad, you argued about, with the age of 18, that's kind of the accepted limit of when someone becomes an adult, and then you said that's when they should be allowed to, go through gender reassignment surgery. My question is, at what age age should we define as when one becomes an adult? And should it then be allowed to ban this type of surgery up until that age, or just ban it entirely?
Certainly, we can have an age to buy cigarettes, which they unfortunately raised recently. Now it's 21 to even buy a cigar. But, you could be 18 to do this, 21 to do that, or the other thing. But more importantly, even once one reaches those ages of maturity, the question is, can certain behaviors be banned? And the answer for all of American history, including today, is yes. Even if these are not issues that directly affect somebody else, yes, they can. Destructive, harmful behaviors can be outlawed. That's why we have laws against heroin and lots of other drugs. That's why we have laws against suicide, still in most states in this country. And that's why we have had laws and ordinances against the kind of transgender transition and surgery. Because we can know something about reality. That's the premise of our government. And we can know that even adults sometimes fall into very destructive habits. And because we're all living together in society, if enough people fall into something like the addiction of heroin, then we won't have a true liberty in this country. We'll have merely licentiousness, which is really just a form of slavery. So we can do that. We have done that for most of American history. And that remains very much still a possibility in America unless the libertines get their way.
Yeah, so I think the question is not so much can we or can we not restrict this. It's should we? And I would just say, do you want your own life restricted? Do you want government officials writing rules about what clothing you're allowed to wear? I mean, I think of it, the COVID experiment reminded to me the importance of bodily autonomy and medical freedom. I don't understand how people can, on one hand, and I'm assuming some of Michael's positions here, but rail against COVID vaccine mandates, be outraged that the government would tell you have to take an injection, and I was, but then also think the government should be able to tell you whether or not you can take testosterone pills. Be outraged at the idea of being forced to wear a mask, but think the government should be able to tell you you can't dress a certain way in public. To me, there's a total cognitive dissonance here. I want to live in an America where adults, as long as they're not hurting anybody else, can live their lives how they see fit. Michael apparently wants to live in a sort of majority rules type of you'll live your life the way the majority of people think you should America, which again isn't going to work out for a minoritarian social conservative faction in a country that's becoming more pro-LGBT, becoming less religious, becoming less traditionalist. It's just not going to work out well for you.
I want to we've had a lot of time for us. More questions from the crowd.
Oh, I have such good points to make.
You both get concluding remarks.
That's true.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Can I stand up? Hi, Michael Knowles.
Hello.
So thank you for persisting and coming to speak here despite multiple setbacks. As someone who is conservative and as a devout Catholic who would like to eventually become a commentator for the Daily Wire, similar to your young colleague, Brett Cooper, would you recommend I start posting YouTube videos about my commentary on YouTube, or to gain an audience and traction, or just email Ben Shapiro to ask him if I can have my own show, or how should I begin my career as a commentator?
I'm going to add an addendum to that question, since I'm also Catholic. What prayer rule of life would you suggest for someone who's going to enter into media? I mean it.
The St. Michael prayer about 24 times a day. Really great question. If you're a friend of mine, I would not recommend emailing Ben Shapiro. That's not going to be the right move. What I would recommend for you is that you get a little bit of political experience. If you want to be a political commentator, I would recommend you get a little bit of political experience. You can work on a campaign. That's actually a great way to get political experience, to know what it's like on the ground and not just what the news says. I would recommend you read everything. The reason I recommend you read everything is because you're young, you're vibrant, and I'm sure you're very well educated, but your views will change as you become educated, and it's a real pity when people become well-known at a young age and they say very stupid things and then they come to regret those things later on. So that's the first thing that I would recommend. As for the prayer life, I'm pretty simple about it. I would recommend a nightly rosary. And very simple. I mean, for people, For people who are interested in the faith, I always think, oh, you could read Thomas Aquinas, you could read St. Augustine, you could read all these wonderful people, and I recommend G.K. Chesterton too, all these people. But pray the rosary, and the other thing I would recommend, I'm not even being cheeky here, is I would recommend praying the St. Michael prayer. It's against all the evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls.
And against our own temptations to wrath, contempt.
Yes. No, this, I hate to add another 30 seconds here, but the other night, it was during Lent, I was talking to a friend of mine, and we were talking about
No, actually, sorry, I can't allow this. Look at the hands, look at the hands.
All right. I'll suppress my wrath even more, I guess. All right.
Can we have another question from the audience? There we go.
Thank you. As I've been listening, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that I'm hearing that there's two different ideologies with each individual. Mr. Palumbo, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like more of a relativistic ideology. Mr. Knowles, it sounds more of this basis that there's a truth that is real and that everyone can discover. So that brings me to the question of the thought that maybe the real question should be, what is truth? Otherwise, it seems like the conversation just keeps going back and forth without finding a tangible outcome. Do you think this topic can be decided before answering the question, what is truth?
Mr. Palumbo, to you first.
Yeah, I think I'd push back on the idea that I'm like a relativist. I mean, that I don't believe every person, like I hate the phrase like your truth, or I do think there is a truth. I think we're all imperfect and unable to perceive the perfect truth. And I guess what I'm arguing is not that there is no truth, but just that the idea of having society or the government top-down decide what the truth is and impose it on all of us is antithetical to what I see as human discovery and flourishing, but also to the actual discovery of getting closer to the truth. Because when what is believed to be true is forced on people and different ideas, wrong ideas mostly, are suppressed, that actually leads to less discovery of getting closer to the ultimate truth. That's what we see. That's why things that were considered complete conspiracy theories a year or two ago are now like, oh yeah, that probably happened. And so that's why I would say it's not that I don't believe there is a truth, it's that I believe that decentralizing truth-seeking is the best approach to get us as imperfect beings closer to it.
And that is what we aim to do in this debate. We're nearing the end of our time. I want to give you time for your last roundup since I've cut you off and you've saved those all up for a rapid fire.
May I answer this question, though, that was raised?
Sorry,
so, I wonder, Brad, if you see the irony in insisting upon your view of society, which is the view that says we can't have standards and we can't use the government and society to impose rules. Because my preferred society is the society in America that we've had pretty much for our nation's history, and it's the view that says that we can set standards and women can have bathrooms and we can just have norms and we can behave in a normal way. And what you're saying is, Michael, that's authoritarian, and so I, the great liberator, I am going to insist that none of you have those standards and those norms.
No, you can have those standards in your community, in your church, in your school, in your business. What you can't do is tell the rest of the world how to live.
You just said I can have it in my community.
Yes.
Okay, so we can have it in my community, but not in someone else's community.
As in your community,
what does that mean?
in terms of a private community setting.
There's no private community. The community's public.
What is your church? Your church is a community.
But my community is Nashville, Tennessee.
All right,
my
well,
state
that's
is
your
Tennessee.
city,
My country is
and I don't
America.
think your city can declare one correct view of the truth for all its residents. I mean, there's plenty of countries you could live in that do those kinds of things.
But all states are like that, because all states have laws and they declare certain things true and others false, and some licit and some illicit. That's what statecraft is.
But that's typically done where the intersection of rights occurs, where one person's right to swing their fist ends where another person's face begins. Not when it comes to questions of individual beliefs being policed by the state.
Like who gets to go into a bathroom?
Well, who owns the bathroom? They can make the rule. You don't own the bathroom.
What about the government? What about the
bathroom.
military bathrooms and the school bathrooms?
The military, it can have its policies about...
But that's the government. So what's the
well,
government going to
obviously
say?
the government has to have its own policies, but that's quite different than telling everybody.
I think I'll pause us here for a moment because I think you've exposed the fundamental rift here. I'm going to give my last question, then we'll have your closing thoughts so people can get home. It's a very short question.
See, now
Okay.
you know how it feels,
Just
Leah.
do it.
You see that?
Just do it.
Huh?
I'm not in a rush.
I would just like to know, for your own later things which you can weave into your closing thoughts if you choose, there are a lot of people out here tonight who think, frankly, both of you are pretty seriously wrong on this issue. And even if you're right here, many of us have something where we later realize we've been wrong and we've harmed people as a result of being wrong. And I'm curious what you think is most helpful to you in realizing where you've been wrong on other issues. But you may give your closing thoughts, and that is merely a suggestion, not gavel enforced. But I think this is an issue like abortion where people think, in good faith on both sides, the stakes are very high, and it's hard to be patient when you think lives are at risk.
Yep.
All right, you get to go first.
I'll answer your question as I walk to the lectern. Personal humility is helpful, and deference to the tradition is probably wise. But now I have to walk back to get my closing remarks, Leah. You can't fool me by having me only answer your question. All right. Wonderful night. Thank you so much to everybody. It's especially a wonderful night because on the precise topic of the debate, my opponent, Brad, seemed to concede a fair bit of it before we began, that the government should in some ways regulate transgenderism. This is great. My first opponent dropped out, so this is a great debate. This is my favorite one I've ever been part of. The law, as we have shown, must regulate transgenderism because transgenderism contradicts the understanding of man and woman long established in our law. Even the most tolerant society cannot simultaneously uphold mutually contradictory principles. Either women get their own bathrooms or they don't. Private enterprise can't solve the problem because the practical implications of transgenderism extend far beyond private business. The law cannot evade the question, QED. Before we go, though, I would like to look a little bit further and ask how the law should regulate transgenderism. We have two options. Embrace transgender anthropology, which is to deny the natural distinction between men and women, or to restore the understanding of sex that accords with reason and reality and which civilization has embraced for all of history. Not a tough choice to me. The law most basically is an ordinance of reason for the common good promulgated by the one who has care of the community. When law becomes unreasonable and untethered from reality, society flounders, as we see increasingly today. We will live according to some standard or another. The only question is whether we'll live in accordance with truth or falsehood. We will summon the confidence to assert the truth, which we can know through our reason and conscience, without which faculties self-government would be impossible, or we will shrug our shoulders like the cynic Pontius Pilate and ask that question we just heard, what is truth? We have seen the rotten fruit of cynical politics. As a citizen in a self-governing republic, I say we ought to live according to the truth, which sets us free and which offers the only path to a flourishing society for everyone. Thank you very much.
The debate we're having here tonight really fundamentally comes down to what kind of a society we want America to be. Do we want to be a pluralistic and classically liberal society where people of different beliefs and values can live side by side? Or do we want to fight in an ever-intensifying struggle, a tug of war over the state, to be used to crush minority viewpoints and force conformity, force people to live how others see fit? I know which one I would like, and I would humbly suggest that the viewpoint of those conservatives, I would humbly suggest that the viewpoint of those conservatives who wish to regulate transgenderism out of existence is incompatible with that fundamental view of America as a place where each person can chart their own way in life as long as they're not hurting anybody else. I also would just reiterate that it's remarkably short-sighted. 30% of America identifies as socially conservative. If you guys really don't want to leave space for different lifestyles, for unpopular viewpoints, that is not going to go well in a democratic society. So if this newfound flavor of authoritarian-style conservatism gets its wishes, it won't just be betraying some of the principles that make America great. It will be setting the stage for its own destruction, and frankly, that destruction will be deserved. Thank you.